Ceres a city on the Volga River where the soil is still dark, not from the Earth's natural composition, from what the Earth absorbed between August 1942 and February ke 1943. 6 months of fighting so concentrated, so sustained, and so completely indifferent to human survival that historians have struggled for 8 decades to find language adequate to what happened, sir. The numbers help, but only a little. Approximately 2 million casualties, dead, wounded, and captured, across both sides over the course of the battle. A city reduced from a functioning industrial center of 500,000 people to a landscape of rubble in which the ruins of buildings provided the primary tactical terrain for fighting that was conducted floor by floor, room by room, and in some documented cases, wall by wall, men on opposite sides of the same partition, neither able to advance, neither willing to retreat, both dying in a space measuring meters rather than kilometers. The Battle of Stalingrad was not the largest battle of the Second World War. It was not the longest. It was not the one with the highest total casualties if you extend the accounting across the entire Eastern Front campaign. What it was, what makes it unlike any other engagement in the history of human conflict, was the specific combination of physical conditions, tactical circumstances, strategic stakes, and the human experience that it produced and sustained for 6 months without interruption or relief. It was a battle in which the normal categories of military analysis, front lines, rear areas, secure positions, command and control, supply routes, the conceptual framework that military doctrine uses to organize the experience of warfare, progressively ceased to apply, and what remained when those categories failed was something more fundamental and more terrible than anything the doctrine was designed to address. This is the story of Stalingrad, not the strategic summary, the actual thing, to understand why Stalingrad happened where it happened and when it happened. You have to understand the strategic situation of the German military in the summer of 1942. The previous summer's campaign, Operation Barbarossa, had failed in its central objective of destroying the Soviet Union as a fighting force in a single campaign season. The Wehrmacht had advanced further and faster than any army in history, and had still not achieved the decisive result that the entire strategic concept required. The Soviet Union had absorbed losses that should have been fatal by any precedent and had not collapsed. It had retreated, it had reconstituted, and by December 1941, it had counterattacked before Moscow, and driven the German forces that had come closest to the Soviet capital by an retreat that the German High Command had not planned for and that the German army had barely survived. Hitler's response to the failure of Barbarossa's original concept was to develop a new strategic objective for the 1942 campaign that addressed what he believed were the root causes of the German army's difficulties. The fuel crisis was primary. The German military machine ran on oil, and Germany's own production and its Romanian imports were insufficient for the scale of operations being conducted. The Caucasus oil fields, centered on Baku, were both a strategic necessity and a strategic opportunity, and the 1942 summer offensive, Case Blue, was designed to reach them by driving southeast through the Don River band and into the Caucasus while simultaneously securing the northern flank of the advance by reaching the Volga River at Stalingrad. Stalingrad, in this original conception, was a secondary objective. The primary goal was oil. Stalingrad mattered because it was a major industrial city producing armaments, because it sat on the Volga which was a critical Soviet supply artery, and because its name contained Stalin's name, which made its capture a propaganda prize of obvious value. But the original case blue planning did not envision Stalingrad as the decisive objective of the campaign. It became the decisive objective through the specific dynamics of a battle that neither side originally intended to fight in the way that it unfolded. The German advance in the summer of 1942 moved with an initial speed that recalled the triumphs of the previous year. Army Group South split into Army Group I and the Army Group B, the former driving toward the Caucasus and the latter toward the Volga. By August, the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, and he had established a corridor to the Volga north of the city. The city appeared, from the German perspective, to be on the verge of falling. Paulus expected a matter of days. It took 6 months. What transformed Stalingrad from an expected rapid capture into the defining battle of the entire war was a combination of Soviet decision-making, the specific geography and the urban structure of the city, and the dynamic of escalating commitment on both sides that neither Hitler nor Stalin was willing to interrupt even when the human cost became impossible to justify by any rational military calculus. Stalin's Order 227, issued in July 1942, the not one step back directive, is the document that defined the Soviet approach to the entire southern campaign and to Stalingrad specifically. The order was not subtle. It threatened commanders who ordered retreats without authorization with court-martial. It established blocking detachments, NKVD units positioned behind Soviet frontline troops with orders to shoot soldiers who retreated without orders. It told the Red Army that there was no more room to retreat, that the Volga was behind them and they would hold. The order was implemented with a literalness that its harshest critics and its most ardent defenders both acknowledge. Blocking detachments did shoot Soviet soldiers who retreated. The specific number of soldiers killed by their own sides blocking units at Stalingrad and across the southern front in 1942 is documented in Soviet military records that were released after the Soviet Union's collapse. It is not a small number. It represents one of the most extreme applications of institutional violence to coerce military performance in the history of modern warfare. And it worked. Not because the threat of execution from behind made Soviet soldiers fight harder than they would have fought for other reasons. They had other reasons in abundance: the defense of their country, their families, their homes, the specific experience of what German occupation looked like that made the alternative to fighting clear to anyone who had seen the occupation in practice. It worked because it removed the institutional permission to retreat that creates the tipping point in any military force where the calculation of individual survival begins to override the collective performance of the unit. By removing that permission explicitly and enforcing the removal violently, Stalin's order changed the terms on which Soviet soldiers made their survival calculations in ways that had direct tactical consequences. The German assault on Stalingrad proper began in earnest on September 13, 1942, with a massive air and artillery bombardment that reduced large portions of the city's residential and commercial areas to rubble before the infantry assault began. The Luftwaffe flew thousands of sorties in the opening phase of the assault, the bombing so intense that the fires in the city were visible from 40 miles away. From the perspective of German military doctrine, the bombardment was preparation for an assault that would then advance rapidly through a stunned and disorganized defense. From the perspective of what actually happened, the bombardment created the conditions that made the German assault impossible to complete. Rubble fights differently from standing buildings. This is a tactical reality that urban warfare specialists have documented extensively in the decades since Stalingrad, but it was something that the Wehrmacht discovered through catastrophic direct experience in the autumn of 1942. Standing buildings can be outflanked, bypassed, entered through windows and doors, their defenders isolated by moving around them. Rubble cannot be outflanked. Rubble is omnidirectional cover and the obstacle simultaneously. A landscape in which every pile of broken concrete is a potential fighting position. Every collapsed floor is a potential barrier to movement. Every destroyed wall creates no angles of fire that did not exist when the building was intact. The bombing that was supposed to destroy Stalingrad's defenses created instead a three-dimensional defensive maze that the German military, optimized for open-country mobile warfare, was uniquely ill-equipped to navigate. The Soviets understood this faster than the Germans did, partly because they had less choice and partly because the commanders who emerged in Stalingrad's defense had the specific practical intelligence of people operating at the shut end of a tactical reality rather than the conceptual frameworks of a headquarters staff. General Vasily Chuikov, who took command of the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad on September 12, the day before the major German assault began, understood within days of his arrival that the key to survival was to get as close to the German front line as possible, close enough that the Luftwaffe could not bomb Soviet positions without hitting German ones, close enough that the German artillery could not fire without similar risk, close enough that the tactical advantage the Germans held in combined arms operations was neutralized by proximity. Chuikov's tactical doctrine, which became known as hugging tactics or storm group tactics, was developed under fire in the specific conditions of Stalingrad and represented a genuine tactical innovation born of necessity. Small assault groups of between 6 and 50 men, organized around a corps of submachine gunners, with grenade throwers, sappers, and light machine gun support, would attack specific buildings or sections of buildings in coordinated rushes, using the rubble as cover for their approach, entering at multiple points simultaneously, and fighting floor by floor and room by room once inside. The groups were given specific local objectives and sufficient autonomy to achieve them without waiting for orders from a headquarters that might be hundreds of meters away and impossible to reach quickly in the combat environment. The German army's response to Chuikov's tactics was to develop its own version of the same approach. The Wehrmacht was not institutionally well suited to the kind of fighting Stalingrad demanded. Its doctrine and training emphasized combined arms operations at the formation level, the coordination of armor, infantry, artillery, and the air power in sequences that required space and time that Stalingrad did not provide. The tank, the instrument of German tactical dominance in the open country campaigns, was nearly useless in the rubble of Stalingrad with the confined spaces exposed to close-range anti-tank weapons and with the broken terrain prevented the maneuver that made armor effective. The professional German infantry, superbly trained and led, found that their training had not fully prepared them for the specific demands of fighting in a destroyed city against an enemy who had decided to die rather than retreat. The grain elevator, the Red October factory, the Barricade gun factory, the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant, the Central Railway Station, which changed hands multiple times in the course of a single day on more than one occasion. These are the specific locations whose names appear in the unit diaries and the personal accounts and the operational records of both sides as the focal points of fighting that went on for weeks in areas measured in hundreds of meters. The grain elevator, a massive concrete structure dominating the southern sector of the city, was defended by a Soviet force initially estimated at about 50 men against German and Romanian forces that committed thousands of men over 10 days of fighting to take it. The defenders, their number impossible to reconstruct precisely from the fragmentary records, held the building for those 10 days before being destroyed or withdrawing. Their resistance had no more significant strategic consequence. It had significant tactical consequence in the specific way that 10 days of resistance in one building has tactical consequence by consuming time and demand and the momentum that the German schedule for taking the city could not absorb without cost. Pavlov's house is the most famous of the specific defensive positions in Stalingrad, famous because it was held for 58 days by a Soviet garrison that began as a four-man reconnaissance group under Sergeant Yakas Pavlov and was reinforced to approximately 25 men from multiple different Soviet nationalities and the units. The house, a four-story apartment building in the center of the city, was fortified by its defenders with machine gun positions, anti-tank guns, and the connecting trench to Soviet lines. The Germans attacked it repeatedly and they never took it. The Soviet commander Chuikov subsequently observed, with a precision that reveals both his tactical intelligence and his dark sense of proportion, that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they lost taking Paris. The Volga was the lifeline of the Stalingrad defense and it was a lifeline of the most extreme kind. The 62nd Army defending the city was separated from the main Soviet forces on the eastern bank by the river, and its supply and reinforcement crossed the Volga under German fire in a night-crushing operation that continued through the entire battle regardless of weather or the intensity of German air and the artillery attack on the crossing points. Men and the supplies moved west across the Volga to the fighting. The wounded who survived moved east to the hospitals on the eastern bank. The boats and the ferries that made the crossing operated in conditions of consistent danger that killed their crews at rates that made the river crossing itself a significant additional source of casualties. The Volga froze in November, and the ice created both new problems and new opportunities. The ice was initially too thin to support heavy loads but too thick to allow boat navigation, creating a period of reduced supply that the 62nd Army endured in the specific way that armies endure what cannot be changed, by continuing to fight with what they had. When the ice thickened enough for vehicle crossing, the logistics improved, but the frozen river offered less protection from German observation and the fire than the water had provided to the night crossings, and the crossing points continued to be targeted throughout the winter. The Soviet strategic response to Stalingrad was being planned while the city fight was at its most intense, and the planning was one of the most closely held secrets of the entire war on the Eastern Front. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive that would encircle the German Sixth Army, was developed through the autumn of 1942 by General Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky in a planning process that involved very few people at the senior levels, and whose security was maintained with a rigor that reflected the specific lesson of previous Soviet operations whose compromise had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The concept was straightforward in its geometry and extraordinarily ambitious in its execution requirements. The German Sixth Army at Stalingrad was holding a bulge of territory that projected eastward to the Volga. On its northern and southern flanks, the line was held not by German forces but by Romanian armies, the Third Romanian Army to the north and the Fourth Romanian Army to the south. The Romanian formations were less well equipped, less well trained, and less motivated than German forces, and the positions had been assessed by Soviet intelligence as potential weak points for months. Uranus would strike both flanks simultaneously with armored forces that would penetrate the Romanian lines, advance rapidly, and link up behind the Sixth Army, cutting it off from the German forces to the west. The operation required assembling a force of approximately 1 million men with supporting armor and the artillery in the region's north and the south of Stalingrad without the German reconnaissance or intelligence apparatus detecting the buildup. The Soviets achieved this through a combination of strict movement and the communications discipline, deliberate deception operations designed to suggest that the assembled forces were defensive rather than offensive in character, and the specific geographical advantage of the steppe terrain east of the Don River, which provided natural concealment for large formations approaching from the east. Operation Uranus launched on November 19 ke 1942. The artillery preparation was, by the accounts of those present, audible at distances of 40 miles. The Third Romanian Army collapsed within hours. The Fourth Romanian Army to the south collapsed the following day. The Soviet armored forces advanced at speeds that the Romanian defensive positions could not slow, and on November 23 RD 1942, the leading elements of the southern and the northern Soviet pincer movements linked tapat kalah on the Don River, closing the encirclement. 330,000 German and the allied soldiers of the Sixth Army and the elements of the Fourth Panzer Army were surrounded. Hitler's response to the encirclement was immediate and categorical. There would be no more breakout. The Sixth Army would hold its positions. It would be supplied by air until a relief operation could penetrate it. The decision has been analyzed and condemned by military historians for 8 decades. The air supply requirement to sustain the Sixth Army was assessed by Luftwaffe operational planners at a minimum of 500 tons per day. The Luftwaffe actual capacity to deliver supplies to the castle, the pocket, under Soviet air opposition and in the winter conditions of the southern Russian steppe, was never more than a fraction of that figure. The maximum daily delivery achieved was approximately 300 tons, and the average was significantly less. The Sixth Army began to starve from the day of the encirclement. The relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, launched in December 1942 under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was the last realistic opportunity to break the encirclement. The Fourth Panzer Army advanced to within approximately 50 kilometers of the Sixth Army's perimeter before being halted by Soviet counterattacks that exploited the thinness of the relief forces' flanks. Polas, commanding the Sixth Army inside the pocket, was ordered not to break out to meet the relief force without Hitler's explicit permission. Hitler did not give it. The relief force was eventually driven back by a new Soviet offensive, Operation Little Saturn, that threatened to shoot it off as well. Winter Storm failed. The Sixth Army was permanently shut off. What followed over the next 2 months inside the castle is one of the most comprehensively documented experiences of mass suffering in military history. Documented because many of the German soldiers who survived captivity eventually returned to Germany, and because the letters that were transported out of the pocket by the final Luftwaffe flights before the pocket was sealed were collected and analyzed by German military authorities as a gauge of morale, and have been published in several editions since the war. The letters tell a story that the official German military communications did not. They tell it in the specific language of men who know they are dying and who are writing to the people who matter to them because the opportunity to write may not last much longer. The letters talk about cold in a way that people who have not experienced the specific cold of the Russian steppe in January cannot fully imagine. Cold that killed men who fell asleep in positions that offered no more shelter. Cold that froze the wounded where they lay. Cold that the inadequate winter clothing of the Sixth Army could not address, because the supplies that might have helped were on transport aircraft that were being shut down or landing at airfields that the advancing Soviets had already captured. The food ration inside the pocket was reduced progressively as the air supply collapsed. By January 1943, the standard ration for a German soldier in the castle was approximately 200 calories per day, roughly equivalent to 1 thick slice of bread. Men ate their horses when the horses died. They ate the horses before they died when the alternative was starvation. They ate things that they did not describe in letters because the description would have been too painful for the people who would read them. The Soviet final offensive against the castle, Operation Ring, launched on January 10 1943, compressed the pocket progressively over 3 weeks. The Sixth Army's outer defensive perimeter collapsed under pressure that could not be sustained by formations that were exhausted, starving, frozen, and in many cases reduced to a fraction of the original strength. The central airfield at Pitomnik, the primary supply and evacuation point for the pocket, was overrun on January 16. The remaining airfield at Gumrak fell on January 22 ND. The last aircraft left the pocket on January 23 RD, taking the last wounded who could be evacuated and leaving behind tens of thousands who could not. Poles was promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler on January 30, 1943, the promotion understood by both parties as an instruction. No more German field marshal had ever been taken prisoner. The promotion was a command to die. Poles surrendered the following day. He was the first German field marshal ever captured by an enemy in battle. The German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad numbered approximately 91,000, the surviving remnant of the 330,000 who had been encircled. The others had died in the fighting, from wounds, from cold, from starvation, or from the specific combination of all three that characterized the final weeks inside the castle. Of the 91,000 who entered Soviet captivity in February 1943, approximately 6,000 survived to return to Germany. The last of them came home in 1955, 12 years after the surrender. The specific mortality rate of German prisoners of war from Stalingrad in Soviet captivity, approximately 95% dead within 2 years, reflects the conditions of the Soviet prisoner of war camps, the state of the men entering them, and the specific status that Stalingrad's prisoners occupied in the Soviet understanding of the war. The strategic consequences of Stalingrad were immediately apparent to anyone who was paying attention, and they extended far beyond the destruction of the Sixth Army. The defeat demonstrated, conclusively and publicly, that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, that it could be surrounded, defeated, and destroyed by the Red Army, and that the specific aura of German military superiority that had dominated European military psychology since September tahun 1939 was a product of specific conditions that no more longer fully obtained. The German public, which had been sustained through the increasingly difficult second half of 1942 by the propaganda ministry's careful management of the Stalingrad narrative, projecting the battle as a heroic defense that would end in victory, learned of the defeat in a broadcast on February 3 RD, 1943 that announced 3 days of national mourning. The reaction was not the renewed determination that the propaganda ministry had calculated. It was the specific quiet of a population that understood, at some level, that it was not yet fully prepared to acknowledge that the war had changed in a fundamental way. Goebbels' response to Stalingrad, the speech at the Berlin Sportpalast on February 18 1943, in which he asked the assembled crowd of party functionaries and especially selected audience members whether they wanted total war, is one of the most documented examples of political performance art in the history of the 20th century. The speech was brilliantly constructed to produce the specific responses it sought from its carefully selected audience. What it could not do was change what had happened on the Volga or what would follow from it. The city itself, Volgograd as it became after Stalin's death in 1953, was rebuilt in the decades after the war on the foundations and in the specific geography of the battleground. The Mamayev Kurgan, the central hill that both sides fought over repeatedly through the entire battle. Because its height provided observation over the whole city and the river crossing points, is today the site of the Motherland Cause Memorial, a massive concrete statue of a woman with a raised sword that is one of the largest statue complexes in the world. The hill itself still contains shrapnel in the soil at densities that made agricultural use of the land impossible for years after the war. The soil is still dark. The bones of the Stalingrad dead are still being recovered. Each year, Russian military archaeology units, the Sura battalions, excavate new sections of the battle area and recover remains that are given formal burial if they can be identified and anonymous burial if they cannot. The recovery operation has been continuous for 3 decades and it shows no more sign of approaching completion. Hundreds of thousands of men on both sides have no more known grave because the battle consumed them in ways that left nothing for identification or because the subsequent decades buried what the battle left behind. What Stalingrad teaches, if teaching is the right word for what a battle of this scale and this horror offers to the people who study it, is something about the relationship between institutional decisions and the individual experience that applies across every level of the conflict. The strategic decisions made by Hitler and Stalin, the fight for the city with total commitment and at any cost, were made by men who were not in the city and who would not be in the city. The individual experience of those decisions was borne by men who had no more voice in making them and no more means of refusing them and who died in a destroyed city on a frozen river at the rate of approximately 15,000 per day at the battle's peak. The distance between the deceased and the dying. The distance between the headquarters where the orders were given and the rubble where the orders were obeyed. That distance is the central moral fact of Stalingrad and it is the central moral fact of every battle in every war that has been fought before or since. The Volga still flows through Volgograd. The water still moves east, toward the Caspian, indifferent to everything that happened on its banks. The soil on the Mamayev Kurgan is still dark. The bones are still in the ground. The letters are in archives. And somewhere in the specific silence of a Russian winter night, if you stand on that hill above the river and listen, the wind through the memorial stones sounds nothing like voices, but it sounds like something. And that something is the only sound that 2 million people left in a place that consumed them. And it will be so long after the last person who remembers what they died for is gone.